Imagine you're lost in a forest, no phone, no GPS, not even a granola bar to quell your hunger. The trees tower over you, the wind howls, and you're pretty sure that rustle in the bushes isn't a friendly squirrel. Now, picture a medieval peasant, clad in rough wool, probably smelling of sweat and turnips, facing the same predicament. They didn't have modern gear, but they weren't helpless. Medieval people, from farmers to knights, crafted tools and techniques that kept them alive in harsh conditions, many of which are so practical they could still get you out of a jam today. Let's explore 7 survival tools that medieval people built. Tools that don't need batteries, Wi-Fi, or a YouTube tutorial to work. These are time-tested solutions, forged in an era where a mistake meant missing dinner. First, let's talk about the medieval survival knife, or as they called it, just a knife. It wasn't a fancy gadget with a built-in flashlight or can opener, but this chunk of iron was everyone's best friend in the Middle Ages. Hand-forged by blacksmiths who probably hummed while hammering glowing metal, the medieval knife was a marvel of simplicity. The blade, usually made of steel or tempered iron, was 15 to 30 centimeters long, useful but not cumbersome. The handle, often wood or bone, was wrapped in leather or cord for a better grip, especially handy when your hands were slick with rain or the blood of a freshly hunted deer. Peasants carried one on their belt, a tool so common it was like the smartphone of its day, except instead of texting, it cut branches, skinned rabbits, or carved an impromptu spoon. Knights didn't leave home without one either, though theirs sometimes had ornate handles because even in the Middle Ages, you had to flex a little. This knife was a multi-tool. You could build a shelter, prepare food, dig roots, carve traps, or, in a pinch, fend off a wolf or bandit. Its strength lay in its sturdy design and constant upkeep. A peasant knew a dull knife was as useless as a lord asking for favors. They sharpened it with whetstones, sometimes carried in a pouch to avoid being caught blunt in the wilderness. Today, a knife remains the top tool in any survival kit. You can use it to cut branches, prepare fish, carve a spear, or even dig a fire pit. If you're lost in the wild with a good knife, you're halfway there. Medieval people knew this, which is why they never left home without one. If they lost their knife, they didn't sulk. They found a sharp rock or flint and carried on. The modern lesson is clear. Invest in a good knife and learn to maintain it. And if you ever find yourself without one, channel that medieval peasant and sharpen a stone. It's not ideal, but it'll do the job. Next, let's look at the snare trap, a gem of medieval ingenuity that hasn't lost its charm. Peasants didn't always have time to chase rabbits with a bow, especially when they had fields to plow or a feudal tax collector to dodge. Instead, they perfected simple but effective traps like the cord snare. These were pure practicality, a rope made from nettle fibers, linen, hemp, or, in dire cases, animal intestines. Yes, medieval people weren't squeamish. The mechanism was simple but brilliant. A stick planted in the ground, a rope with a slip knot, and a natural trigger like a flexible branch. An animal, a rabbit, hare, or even a small deer, would step or stick its head into the loop, trigger the mechanism, and get caught. The best part? The trap worked on its own. While the peasant gathered firewood, fixed their hut, or argued with a neighbor over a missing chicken, the snare did its magic. Setting it up required knowing animal paths, an art medieval people mastered by observing nature like detectives. They knew where rabbits passed daily or where deer drank. Today, snare traps are still legal in many places for survival, though check local laws. You don't want a fine for poaching in a national park. They're easy to set up with natural materials: vine rope, a flexible branch, and some patience. If you know where to place them, you can catch anything from a rabbit to a pheasant. Medieval people didn't have survival manuals or tracking apps, so they practiced until their slip knots were perfect. If you want to try, start with a simple knot and ensure the rope is strong but not too thick. Patience is key. Nature doesn't hand out prizes on the first try. And a tip: don't put all your hopes in one trap. Medieval people set multiple snares to boost their odds. If they failed, they didn't give up. They adjusted the loop and tried again. Now, let's talk about the branch and leaf shelter, or as medieval people saw it, a place to not freeze to death. Not everyone had a cozy cabin with a fireplace and a bubbling stew pot. Shepherds tending flocks on remote hills, hunters tracking deer for days, or travelers caught in a storm needed a place to take cover. Their solution was a shelter made from what the forest offered: branches, leaves, bark, and, if lucky, some mud. The technique was so simple it seems obvious, but it required cunning. First, they found a sturdy base, like a fallen tree, a large rock, or two trees close together. They stacked branches at an angle to form a tent-like structure, steep enough for rain to slide off. Then, they covered it with dry leaves, moss, ferns, or bark, piling on thick layers to insulate against cold and wind. If mud was available, they smeared it into cracks to seal the shelter, like natural cement. These shelters weren't luxurious, but they kept you dry and alive through a cold night. Soldiers on campaign, especially during long sieges or marches through hostile lands, used them too. A knight might have shiny armor, but if stuck in a forest during a downpour, he and his squire built one of these without hesitation. Today, survival experts still use this technique because it's quick, versatile, and doesn't require complex tools. You can build one in a couple of hours with just a knife and your hands. The key is choosing an elevated spot to avoid flooding and piling on enough insulating material. Medieval people knew a small shelter was better. A compact space traps more body heat. They also avoided building near swollen rivers or under dead trees that might fall in the wind. If you try it, use dry leaves, wet ones are terrible for insulation, and check for ants or critters in your materials. Nobody wants to wake up with a spider nest for a pillow. Medieval people didn't have thermal sleeping bags, but a thick layer of dry leaves could be nearly as effective. A bonus trick, if they could, they dug a small trench inside the shelter to lie in, which helped retain heat. The lesson here is that you don't need a high-tech tent. With some ingenuity and what nature provides, you can build a temporary home to stay alive. Friction fire, specifically the bow drill, is another medieval genius move that deserves applause. Starting a fire without matches isn't easy, but medieval people mastered it like an art form. The bow drill was their go-to method, and while it takes practice, it's surprisingly effective. It consisted of a wooden bow, a curved, flexible branch, with a cord of plant fibers, leather, or even horsehair. They tied the cord to the bow, wrapped it around a dry wooden stick, the drill, and spun it rapidly against a softwood board, like willow or poplar. The friction generated heat, then a small ember, which they carefully transferred to a tinder nest. Dry grass, moss, plant fluff, or even feathers. With a gentle blow, that ember became a flame, and voila! You had fire to cook, warm yourself, or keep wolves at bay in the night. This method required patience, some muscle, and the right wood conditions. Medieval people knew wet wood was the enemy, so they sought dry branches or cut into the dry core of fallen logs. Shepherds used it to stay warm on hills, travelers to cook on the road, and soldiers to boost morale in cold camps. Today, the bow drill remains a top survival technique because it doesn't rely on modern tools. All you need is dry wood, a sturdy cord, and the will to keep going after 10 minutes of rubbing with no results. Medieval people didn't have lighters or online tutorials, so they perfected this through trial and error. If you try it, brace for blisters and a newfound respect for those who did it without complaining. The key is a steady rhythm, not brute force. Friction does the work. Good tinder is crucial. Dry moss or dandelion fluff works well. A medieval tip: keep your tinder in a leather pouch to stay dry, because a damp ember won't catch. If you master the bow drill, you'll feel like a true medieval survivor, ready to take on the forest with just your wits and a stick. Another tool medieval people perfected was the improvised water filter. Water in the Middle Ages wasn't always a delight. Rivers could be muddy, full of leaves, or, near villages, worse things I won't detail. Travelers, shepherds, and hunters needed potable water, but they couldn't always boil it, especially if firewood was scarce or time was tight. Their solution was a rudimentary but effective filter: layers of cloth, charcoal, and sand. They took a piece of linen or thick wool, sometimes folded several times, and filled it with charcoal from old campfires and clean stream sand. They poured water through this makeshift filtration column, and while it didn't kill all bacteria, they didn't know bacteria existed. It removed sediment, large particles, and some bad taste. In a pinch, they used just cloth or even porous bark, like birch, which has natural filtering properties. Monks traveling between monasteries often carried small filters like these in their satchels, knowing questionable water could ruin a pilgrimage. Today, improvised filters remain a key survival trick. You can replicate them by cutting a plastic bottle in half, filling it with crushed charcoal, sand, and gravel, and covering the exit with clean cloth. It won't give you bottled water, but it can save you from a stomach bug. Medieval people didn't know microbiology, but their instincts told them murky water was bad news, and they acted accordingly. A bonus trick: if they could, they let water sit before filtering to let larger particles settle. If you're in a bind, find charcoal from a recent campfire, ensure it's free of toxic ash, and clean stream sand. Patience and observation were medieval keys, and they still are today. The handmade fishing net is another medieval tool that hasn't lost its value. Rivers, lakes, and streams were vital food sources, but sitting with a fishing rod wasn't practical for most. Instead, medieval people wove nets from metal fibers, linen, hemp, or even animal hair. These could be small for hand use in shallow streams or larger to set in rivers and work alone for hours. Weaving a net was an art requiring time and skill. Village women often handled this, using spindles and nimble fingers to create meshes fine enough for small fish but strong enough to withstand currents. Medieval fishermen knew exactly where to place them: in river bottlenecks where water narrowed or in still pools where fish gathered to rest. Sometimes, they used stones as weights or branches as floats to hold the net in place. This technique was so effective that a fisherman could feed a whole family with a good catch. Today, an improvised net made from rope, torn clothing strips, or even an old parachute, if you have one, can catch fish, crustaceans, or even frogs in a survival situation. The key is observing the water. Look for bubbles, movement, or shadows indicating fish. Medieval people didn't have marine biology books, but they studied rivers for hours, learning fish habits like nosy neighbors. If you want to try, start with a small net and practice in a calm stream. Don't get frustrated if fish don't bite right away. Medieval people knew fishing was a game of patience. A bonus trick: in clear water, you can use branches to herd fish toward the net, a technique peasants used to maximize catches. Lastly, let's talk about the walking staff, a tool so simple it's almost overlooked but was indispensable in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just a stick to lean on, it was a wooden Swiss army knife. Shepherds, pilgrims, and travelers carried a sturdy staff, usually oak, ash, or hazel, cut from a straight branch and polished by use. This staff helped stabilize on uneven terrain, ford rivers, push aside brambles, or fend off wild animals or dim-witted bandits. Pilgrims walking hundreds of miles to places like Santiago de Compostela used it to test stream depths or hang a bag of provisions. Shepherds turned it into an impromptu weapon, delivering a sharp blow to a wolf getting too close to the sheep. Some even carved marks on the staff to measure distances or track days. In combat, a good staff could be as effective as a sword in trained hands, and peasants often practiced fighting techniques with it. Today, a walking staff remains an underrated but vital survival tool. It can help you cross a river, build a shelter as a support, dig a hole, or even improvise a stretcher if someone's injured. Medieval people chose strong but lightweight wood, sometimes fire-hardened to prevent splitting. If you're in the wild, look for a straight branch about 1.5 meters long, strip it of knots, and test it to ensure it won't break. A good staff not only gives physical support but also makes the forest feel less intimidating. Medieval people knew this, which is why you never saw a pilgrim or shepherd without their trusty wooden companion. These 7 tools, the knife, snare trap, branch shelter, bow drill, water filter, fishing net, and walking staff, aren't just relics of a bygone era. They're testaments to human ingenuity, created by people living on the edge of survival without manuals or modern tech. Each required deep environmental knowledge, patience, and a spark of creativity. Medieval people didn't have camping stores or map apps, but they observed, experimented, and adapted. Their tools were simple, but that simplicity makes them timeless. Today, in a world so reliant on technology, these techniques remind us that nature isn't an enemy but an ally if you know how to work with it. So, the next time you're in the forest, lost or not, think like a medieval peasant. Grab a stick, sharpen a knife, weave a rope, and build a shelter. You won't just survive. You'll feel like a true medieval master, ready to take on the world with nothing but your wits and a couple of branches. To dive deeper into these tools, it's worth considering how medieval people adapted them to different environments. Take the knife, for example. In the Scottish Highlands, shepherds used shorter, sturdier blades, ideal for cutting peat or skinning sheep. In Germany's dense forests, hunters preferred longer blades for carving wood and clearing brush. The knife's versatility made it indispensable, but its design varied by region and purpose. A village blacksmith could spend hours forging a single blade, heating the metal until it glowed red, hammering it, and quenching it in water or oil to temper it. This wasn't just manual labor, it was almost a ritual, producing a tool that could last generations. Peasants often inherited knives from their parents, and it wasn't uncommon for a knife to pass through several hands before losing its edge forever. In modern survival, this attention to detail teaches us to value quality over quantity. A cheap supermarket knife might break on its first use, but a well-made, simple one can be a lifeline. Snare traps also had regional variations. In mountainous areas where animals were warier, hunters used more flexible branches, like hazel, for traps with greater tension. In plains where rabbits were plentiful, traps were smaller and set in series, forming a kind of capture network. Medieval people learned from failures. If a trap didn't work, they adjusted the knot, changed the location, or tried different bait, like a root or fruit. This trial-and-error approach is something modern survivors can emulate. It's not enough to set a trap and hope. You have to observe, tweak, and, above all, not give up. Medieval people didn't have time to complain. If a trap failed, they just tried again, because hunger doesn't wait. Branch shelters also adapted to the environment. In England's wet forests, peasants used birch bark, naturally waterproof, to cover their shelters. In drier southern Europe, they preferred oak or pine leaves, which were more abundant. In winter, some added a layer of compacted snow over the leaves for extra insulation, a trick Nordic peoples perfected. Building a shelter was an exercise in ingenuity. You had to choose a wind-sheltered spot, away from flood-prone streams, and ensure the branches were strong enough not to collapse under rain. Medieval people also knew size mattered. A shelter too large was hard to heat, while a small one trapped body heat like an improvised oven. Today, bushcraft experts follow these principles, sometimes adding a modern tarp, but the foundation is the same. Use what you have, be practical, and don't underestimate the power of dry leaves. The bow drill, while universal, also had nuances. In humid regions, medieval people stored tinder in waterproof leather pouches or dried it in the sun before use. In drier areas like southern France, they used softer woods like cedar, which produced embers faster. The technique required not just strength but rhythm. Erratic movement could wear out the wood without generating heat. Medieval people often worked in teams. One handled the bow, another prepared tinder, and a third kept watch for curious animals. This sense of community is something modern survival sometimes overlooks, where we tend to think of the lone wolf. Medieval people knew teamwork increased success, whether lighting a fire or building a shelter. If you try the bow drill today, don't be ashamed to ask for help. Even the toughest peasants knew 4 hands were better than 2. The improvised water filter also varied by available resources. In coastal areas with abundant sand, filters were thicker and more effective. In forests where charcoal was common, medieval people crushed campfire remnants into fine powder to better trap impurities. Some even added small river stones for an extra filtration layer. It wasn't advanced science, but it worked well enough to keep them hydrated without getting sick. Today, improvised filters remain a key skill, especially where clean water is scarce. A modern trick is to combine this with boiling, if you can make a fire, to maximize water safety. Medieval people didn't have that knowledge, but their instinct to experiment and adapt remains a valuable lesson. Fishing nets also adapted to the environment. In fast mountain rivers, nets were smaller and tougher, designed to withstand strong currents. In calm lakes, they could be larger and lighter, covering wider areas. Medieval people often used nets alongside other techniques, like moving branches in the water to scare fish into the trap. This holistic approach, using multiple tools and techniques together, is something modern survivors can learn from. Don't rely on one solution. Combine nets, traps, and observation to maximize resources. And if you fail, don't give up. Medieval people knew fishing was a game of persistence. The walking staff, meanwhile, was more than a practical tool. It was a symbol of autonomy. Pilgrims decorated theirs with shells or ribbons, making it a reminder of their journey. Shepherds carved marks to count sheep or days. In combat, staffs were used in peasant fighting techniques, like the English quarterstaff, which could knock out an opponent with a well-placed strike. This versatility makes the staff so valuable today. You can use it to probe terrain, build a structure, or even as an improvised weapon. Medieval people chose it carefully, testing branches for the right balance of weight and strength. If you're in the wild, take time to pick a good staff. You won't regret it when it saves you from a slip in a river or helps you fend off a curious snake. In summary, these medieval tools weren't just practical, they were a way of life. Each reflected a deep understanding of the environment, adaptability, and a never-give-up mindset. Medieval people didn't have luxuries, but they had ingenuity, and that was enough. Today, when technology sometimes fails us, these techniques remind us that survival doesn't depend on expensive gadgets but on observing, learning, and working with what you have. So, the next time you're in the wild, lost or just enjoying it, think like a medieval. Grab a knife, weave a rope, build a shelter, and light a fire. You won't just survive, you'll feel like you've conquered the forest, just as they did centuries ago.